G'day Internet, my name's Chris and welcome to Mac's Workshop. Today I'm going to show you how I made this inexpensive plywood bookshelf. I've tried to keep the construction of this pretty simple, and with the exception of the drawers, you should be able to put this together with little more than a skill saw, a cordless drill and a few other common workshop tools. I made this cabinet specifically for my son's bedroom, but hopefully what you can take away from this is how easy it can be to build a simple plywood cabinet that suits your own needs. While this is simple, every project presents learning opportunities, and I definitely made some mistakes on this one. Come along on the ride with me, find out what they were and how I dealt with them. To get started, we're going to cut up our plywood into manageable pieces. To do this, all you need is a straight edge and a skill saw. I've got a straight edge that I can clip directly onto my plywood, but you can easily just get a piece of wood and clamp that down for a straight edge as well. After trimming the edge, I want to cut it to the height of the cabinet. I want to cut the large pieces out of my plywood first, as I don't want to be left with a whole lot of small pieces that I can't use. Before moving on to cutting the size of the cabinet, I need to trim this edge as well. And you can see here I made a mistake. I didn't clamp my workpiece down before making the cut, and as I'm slicing through that wood you can see it moving on me. That's not only going to give me a bad cut, but it's also kind of dangerous having the wood move on you while you're trying to cut it, so make sure you clamp it down. You might have noticed I'm not using my fancy clip-on straight edge here. Unfortunately it's not quite long enough for the long cut I need to do. So here you can see I'm just clamping a straight edge directly to my work and making the cut along that. As crummy as my workbench looks, I don't want to get cuts all the way down it, so I put a few bits of scrap wood underneath my plywood, and this makes sure that my blade's not going to go into the bench top. With one side cut, it's just a matter of repeating the same process again to get the second side. With the sides cut, it's time to move on to the shelves. I'm going to use a combination of the table saw and my skill saw to cut these down, but if you don't have a table saw you could keep using that skill saw and a straight edge and you'd be fine. This is probably a good time to call out the plywood I'm using here. Usually I'd head off to the local hardware store and pick some choice pieces to make the cabinet out of. But unfortunately we're in lockdown right now and that can't happen. I had to order it and make do with what I got. I'm not making fancy furniture here, so I don't need something super good, but you can usually choose something with a few less knots and bows in it if you pick it yourself. With the full size shelves cut, it's time to move on to the half size shelves. I'm going to continue using the table saw to rip these down. With the half-size shelves ripped, it's time to cut them to length. I use a cross-cut sled to cut the two small shelves to ensure I get them both at the same size. Then I use the miter saw to cut the vertical divider. It's right here at this moment that I make the biggest mistake of the project. Stick around to the end to find out what it was. Now it's time for my favourite part of the project, the sanding. One thing you might have noticed is on my pieces I have a good side and a bad side. This is a cost saving measure. Usually, however, A bad side is not quite as bad as these sides. This is going to be okay for the shelves because they'll be facing downwards and you won't see them, but I'm going to have a few problems trying to hide them on the sides. One thing I like to do when making plywood furniture is to paint some of it, just to give it some point of difference so it's not just plain plywood. I don't like to paint all of it because I do like the look of the plywood, but just having some colour difference there makes it stand out. I wanted to keep this project pretty simple, so I wanted to stay away from dados and rabbets and just glue and screw it together. In retrospect, gluing and screwing has its own set of issues, so I may have been better off using a dado for my joins. So to start off the construction, I want to put the mid-sized shelves together. While I am going to screw them together, I don't want the screws to be visible, so I'm going to drill some countersunk holes that I'm going to be able to fill with a dowel later on. A handy trick I use to keep my shelf aligned while screwing it into place is to cut a scrap piece of wood exactly the distance the shelf should be from the bottom. I then clamp the scrap wood onto the side, keeping it flush with the bottom. With the scrap secure, I can hold my shelf against it, drill my screw holes before finally driving the screws in. To fill the holes, I'm going to cut some small dowels with this plug cutter, but you could easily use some pre-made dowels of the same diameter as your hole. After you've cut the plugs, you can pop them out with a screwdriver. With the plugs ready, aim the glue slightly off to the side of your hole and make a big mess of things. Seriously though, one thing I discovered was that it's okay for your plugs to be slightly loose in the hole. The wood will swell into place and look exactly the same, removing the need to hammer the plugs in as you see me doing here. After waiting for the glue to dry, cut the plugs flush and give them a quick sand. With the first shelf done, it's just a matter of rinse and repeat for the second. You'll notice with the second set of plugs, I've drilled the hole slightly bigger and I can just push the plugs in with my hand, no need for a hammer. I want to reset the back panel into the cabinet, so I'm going to cut some rabbets in the sides, top and bottom shelf to sit the panel into. To make sure I cut my rabbets in the right place, I cut two small bits of scrap that are exactly the distance from my router bit to the edge of the router. I then use these with two more scraps that are exactly the same width as the backing board to position the straight edge for my router to run against. This will ensure that the rabbets are exactly the right depth for the back panel. After setting the depth of the router bit to about 5mm, I run the router against the fence to cut the rabbet. With the rabbet cut into the top shelf, I repeat the process on both sides. The back panel is only for the top half of the cabinet, so I only need to run the rabbet to the point in which the first shelf is. After the rabbets are cut on the side panels, I square off the ends with a chisel. Before I start the final assembly, I need to screw the bottom divider panel in place, as it will be hard to get a drill in there later on. To make sure I screw the divider in the right place, I clamp a piece of scrap for the panel to butt into, This isn't the most accurate way, and I do have some issues with square later on, but for a quick project it's all good. Now that all the internal parts are screwed together, it's time to put the sides on. This is a good time to point out that I never did a dry fit, and that's going to bite me very soon, given that I've already assembled some parts. You'll notice how I'm adding a packer below the shelves. This is to account for the backing board that I'll put on later. And here we come to the most annoying mistake of the project. I had managed to cut the small shelves too short, and yes, they were the ones that I'd glued the dowels over the screws. Luckily, with the power of editing, I can fix this with a snap of a finger. Seriously though, to fix this, I had to cut and paint new shelves, drill out the dowel plugs carefully so I could get to the screws, then repeat the original process. With the main carcass screwed together, apart from the sides that need filling and painting, I was pretty happy with how it looks. The next step is to put the backing board on, and then finally to make the drawers. Remember how we routed a rabbet on the sides and the top and bottom shelf? Here's what it looks like assembled. This is where we're going to put the backing board. Back off to the table saw to cut the backing board out of some 12mm ply. Fits like a glove. I measure where the shelves meet the backing board and proceed to nail the backing board using a brad nailer. Before moving on to the drawers, I fill the holes on the sides and any other screw holes that need hiding with some wood filler. I will sand this later on and paint it. I'm going to make 3 simple drawers to fit into one of the bottom compartments. I start off by cutting all the sides on the table saw using the crosscut sled to get accurate, repeatable cuts. Unlike the carcass, I'm going to route some rabbets to help with the construction of the drawers. Every side of every drawer will need a rabbet on the bottom for the bottom panel and rabbets on the front and back to take the front and back panels. I don't have a dado stack or a router table, so the easiest way I can cut these dados is by setting my table saw blade to a height of 5mm and making multiple passes until I've cut all the rabbets to the required widths. After cutting some rabbets into the front and back panel of each drawer, I cut the bottom panels out of some 12mm ply and am ready for a dry fit of the drawers. With a successful dry fit, I move on to gluing them up and securing them with brad nails. I don't bother with clamps, as the nails should be enough to hold it together while the glue dries. To help position the rails, I cut a few scraps of wood. The first one is 10mm. This represents the gap that I want between the bottom of the cabinet and the bottom of the drawer. The second is my drawer height minus the rail height divided by 2. I can then stack them together and put my rail on top and know it will be in the exact centre of the drawer when fitted. The drawers are going to be flush with the cabinet, so I make sure the rails are positioned back 17mm, which is the width of the drawer face. Being careful not to bump the rail, I drill and screw it into position, checking that it hasn't moved in between screws. After both rails are in place, I leave my 10mm spacers and sit the drawer on top of them. I can then slide the inside part of the rail out to be flush with the front of the drawer box and proceed to drill and screw the inner rail. The only difference when attaching the rails for the second and third drawers is that I use a 20mm spacer between them, as I want a 20mm gap between the drawers. The last thing I need to cut is the drawer faces, and I rip them down quickly on the table saw. A handy tip I saw on another channel was to use cards to help space your drawer faces evenly. Then, after the face is positioned correctly, clamp it in place and remove the drawer. With the drawer removed, you can drill and screw the drawer face from the inside. Alright, we're ready for the last part. Handles finally arrived, so it's time to attach them onto the front of the drawers. Now, I could just draw a line across there and measure it out, but I've already got several things wrong, so I'm going to take it a little bit cautious today. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a scrap bit of wood and I'm going to measure the holes in the scrap bit of wood. Make sure that they're all in the right place and that the handle falls in properly. Then I can just hold my scrap bit of wood referenced against the bottom right corner and drill my holes straight through into my drawer. It doesn't really matter what the width or height of your scrap bit of wood is, as long as it is tall enough to cover half of the drawer and wide enough to get past that end hole there. So I'm going to measure that up now. Now that we've got our holes drilled, we want to make sure that they line up with our handles, just in case we got the measurements wrong. So just chuck your screws in, and put your handle over the top, make sure they're all in right correctly. That looks pretty good to me. Time to drill some holes. One last thing I'm going to do is, before I start screwing the holes in, is I'm planning to just hold that there and drill these holes in, but it's going to be far too easy for that wood to slide around. So I'm just going to get a bit of scrap and I'm going to screw that to the side there, which means I can hold that in place without fear of it slipping. There we go. It's a beautiful thing. Well, that's it. I hope you were able to take something away from that to use in your own future project. Feel free to like and subscribe if you think I earned it. Thanks for watching, and until next time.